Tonight we stand at the edge of a spring in the desert, where water rose from the earth and drew human beings to it long before kings wore crowns, long before scribes pressed signs into clay, long before stone pyramids cut their shadows across the sands of Egypt. Tonight we journey to Jericho, one of the oldest places on earth where people gathered not merely for a season, not merely for a hunt, not merely for the passing comfort of fire beneath the stars, but to stay here in the deep basin of the Jordan Valley, beneath a sun that can bleach bone white and a sky vast enough to swallow memory. There lies a mound. At first glance it is modest, a swelling of earth, a rise in the landscape, a place where palms whisper in the hot wind, and the ancient spring still murmurs as it has murmured for ages beyond reckoning. But beneath that mound, beneath the dust and stones and broken fragments of later ages, there is a story so old that it almost escapes the reach of imagination. For buried here are the remains of people who lived around 11,000 years ago, around 9,000 years before Christ, in a world that had not yet learned the habits of civilization as we usually define it. No palaces, no writing, no empires, no armies marching beneath banners, no coins, no laws carved into stone, no monuments raised by divine kings, and yet they built, they planned, they gathered, they shaped the earth around them with intention. They raised walls of stone where no city was supposed to stand. And that is the mystery. Because Jericho appears before the script we were taught, it appears before the neat sequence that says first came farming, then villages, then towns, then cities, then states, then civilization. Jericho does not sit quietly inside that ladder of progress. It disturbs it. It asks something deeper. What if human beings did not become builders simply because they had grain? What if the first great acts of construction were born from fear, ritual, memory, identity, or the need to bind many families into one living body? What if civilization was not invented all at once by kings and accountants, but slowly, painfully, mysteriously, beside water in a harsh land, by people whose names are lost, but whose hands are still present in stone? The ancient inhabitants of Jericho were not primitive shadows stumbling blindly toward modernity. They were our equals in mind, in imagination, in grief, in wonder. Their tools were different. Their world was different. But they watched the same moon rise. They buried their dead beneath their floors. They woke to hunger, to danger, to childbirth, to illness, to the changing weather, to the terrifying beauty of existence. They knew the voices of animals in the dark. They knew the taste of dust. They knew the importance of water. They knew that a place could become sacred if enough generations remained there. Archaeology brings them back to us, not as ghosts of legend, but as evidence. Through radiocarbon dating, stratigraphic excavation, lithic analysis, botanical remains, and the study of ancient architecture, the buried life of Jericho begins to emerge from silence. It does not emerge complete. It never does. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We are left with fragments, stones, seeds, bones, floors, walls, and the long labor of interpretation. We are left answerless, adrift to ponder why people who had only just begun the great experiment of settlement raised a stone tower unlike anything else known from its time. Imagine the dawn, not the dawn of one morning, but the dawn of settled life, Families waking inside rounded mud houses, smoke rising low over rooftops, children moving between walls of packed earth, hunters returning from the open country with gazelle, gatherers carrying baskets of wild grain, dogs moving close to the hearth, elders sitting near doorways, their memories stretching back to parents and grandparents who had also lived beside the spring. Somewhere, perhaps, stone was being quarried. Somewhere, people were carrying heavy blocks in the heat. Somewhere, a decision had been made that this place mattered enough to defend, to mark, to transform. The wall of Jericho is not only a wall, it is a question made of stone. Was it raised against enemies, against flood waters, against wild animals, against the chaos of a world changing after the end of the Ice Age? Or was it a boundary between the known and unknown, between those within and those without, between the living community and the dangerous forces beyond the edge of settlement? The tower, built into or beside that wall, deepens the enigma. Rising above the houses, with an internal staircase climbing through its body, it suggests planning, shared labor, and a vision that reached beyond simple shelter. It suggests that the people of Jericho could organize themselves around something larger than household survival. But what was that something? There are places in human history where the ground seems to crack open and reveal that our old categories are too small. Jericho is one of those places. It belongs to a time when gods and mortals, ancestors and descendants, the living and the dead, may not have been separated in the way they are now. It belongs to a world where the buried skull of a loved one could remain close to the household, where plastered faces might preserve the memory of the dead, where the presence of ancestors could strengthen claims to land, family, and belonging. It belongs to a world in which practical life and sacred life were likely woven so tightly together that to separate them is to misunderstand them. And yet we must be careful. The past is not a blank wall upon which we paint our desires. The archaeologist moves slowly. A layer is scraped, a floor is recorded, a stone tool is measured, a seed is identified, a sample is dated, a burial is mapped, the work is patient, and the conclusions must remain humble. Jericho rewards imagination, but it punishes certainty. Every answer leads deeper into the mound. Tonight, then, we are not merely asking whether Jericho was the first city. We are asking what a city truly is. Is it a population number, a wall, a marketplace, a temple, a memory shared by people who refuse to leave? Is it the moment when human beings begin to shape not just shelters, but worlds? And if Jericho was not a city in the later sense, perhaps it was something even more important, a threshold, a gathering place at the edge of possibility, a living experiment in permanence. So come to the spring, come to the stones, come to the ancient mound where the first builders left their mark before civilization had a name. Take your place among the dust, the heat, the palms, and the hidden dead beneath the floors. And before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know where in the world you are watching from and what the local time is where you are. The mound rises quietly from the plain, not as a mountain, not as a fortress, not as the broken skeleton of a palace, but as something older and stranger. Tel es Sultan, the ancient mound of Jericho, is made not by nature alone, but by human return. A tell is a hill of time. It grows when people build, live, burn, abandon, return, demolish, level, and build again. Walls collapse, floors are sealed, hearths are covered, graves are cut into earlier rooms, mud brick melts back into earth. Century after century, the settlement lifts itself upward, until the past becomes a mound, and the mound becomes a riddle. To stand before such a place is to stand before a compressed archive of human desire, not parchment, not carved inscription, not royal chronicle. The archive here is made of ash, plaster, stone, bone, seeds, and soil. Its pages are layers, its grammar is stratigraphy. Every band of earth matters, every color change, every packed surface, every pit edge, every fallen wall, every fragment of tool or skull or burnt grain belongs to a long sequence of human decisions. This is where archaeology becomes almost surgical. The spade may open the earth, but only patience reads it. For much of history, Jericho was known less as a prehistoric settlement than as a place of sacred memory. It stood near roots of pilgrimage, conquest, and story. It belonged to landscapes where legend accumulated like dust upon stone. Travelers came and saw the oasis, the palms, the spring, the ruins, the shimmer of heat rising from the valley floor. They carried away impressions of antiquity, but the deeper truth remained locked beneath the mound. The Jericho of 11,000 years ago did not announce itself with inscriptions. It waited in silence. The first great revelations required excavation, not treasure hunting, not the reckless chase for spectacular objects, but careful entry into a settlement that had died and returned many times. Early investigators cut into the mound with the questions of their age. They looked for the city of familiar stories, for walls that might speak to later histories, for evidence that could be matched with texts and traditions. Yet as trenches deepened, something unexpected began to appear. Beneath the remains of more recent towns and fortified phases lay far older deposits. Beneath pottery-bearing layers lay a world before pottery. Beneath the known city lay a settlement from a time when city life, by conventional logic, should scarcely have existed. This was the first great astonishment of Jericho. The mound was not merely ancient, it was almost impossibly ancient. Stratigraphic excavation revealed layer after layer of occupation. The later Bronze Age city, with its own destructions and rebuilding, belonged to a world already rich in conflict and long-distance contact. But below that were Neolithic deposits of extraordinary depth. The farther the archaeologists descended, the more the timeline stretched. Pottery vanished, metals vanished, written names vanished. The people remained, but the signs by which later civilization recognized itself were gone. In their place came stone tools, plaster floors, mud architecture, burials, and the heavy silence of a community without texts. Then came the wall. It was not a thin enclosure, it was not a minor boundary. It was a substantial stone construction, massive enough to demand organization, planning, labor, and intent. Nearby stood the tower, circular, monumental, with stone steps rising inside it. This was no accident of erosion. This was no random pile of collapsed rubble. It was architecture. It was design. It was a structure from deep prehistory that seemed to speak in a language scholars had not expected to hear so early. Imagine the moment of recognition, a trench descending into compacted deposits, the sun burning above, workers clearing stones from earth hardened by ages, a curve becoming visible, a face of masonry appearing from the soil, a feature first uncertain, then unmistakable. The archaeologist sees not an object, but an order, not a loose cluster, but a planned form. At such moments, time does not feel like a smooth river. It feels like a trapdoor. Radiocarbon dating later helped anchor Jericho's earliest substantial settlement in the pre-pottery Neolithic, around the 10th millennium before the present, with roots commonly placed near the 9th millennium before Christ. These dates matter because they drag the human story into uncomfortable territory. They force us to imagine builders before kings, social labor before states, communal identity before writing, monumental effort before the familiar machinery of civilization. The stones of Jericho were not raised by pharaohs. They were not commanded by a king whose name survives. They belonged to a world where authority, if it existed, has left no title. And because there are no written records, the mound must be interrogated through method. Lithic analysis studies the chipped stone tools, the blades, scrapers, points, and sickle elements that reveal how people cut grain, processed plants, hunted animals, shaped wood, and carried out daily work. Microscopic wear along edges can show whether a blade sliced reeds, hide, meat, or cereal stalks. Botanical remains, often recovered through careful sampling, allow us to glimpse the plant world of the settlement. Animal bones speak of hunting, herding, diet, season, and environment. Architecture speaks through shape, rebuilding, alignment, and investment. But the mound is never simple. Each layer is both evidence and disturbance. People dug pits into earlier deposits. Later walls cut through older floors. Burials intruded into abandoned spaces. Erosion moved material. Mud brick decayed into soil that can be difficult to distinguish from ordinary earth. Ancient life does not preserve itself politely for the modern investigator. It folds, breaks, burns, and mixes. Still, with slow excavation and careful recording, patterns emerge. The early settlement at Jericho was not a moment. It was a process. Houses were built and repaired. Floors were renewed. Dead were placed beneath domestic spaces. Walls were raised, perhaps rebuilt, perhaps reinterpreted by generations who no longer remembered the first reason for their construction. The mound itself became a participant in community life. People lived upon the remains of those before them, sometimes literally above the bones of their ancestors. The ground was not empty ground. It was inheritance. This is what makes Tel es-Sultan so powerful. It is not merely that people lived there early. Other groups lived in many places. It is that they stayed long enough to create depth. They returned long enough for memory to become architecture. They built heavily enough for their labor to survive. The mound is the physical result of repetition, and repetition is one of the beginnings of civilization. To plant a post in the same place, to renew a floor, to bury the dead beneath the home, to carry stone for a wall, to defend or define a settlement, to remain by the spring through seasons of scarcity and plenty. All of this marks a profound shift in the human relationship with place. The great mystery is not only what Jericho was, it is how a place becomes necessary. A camp can be left behind. A hunting ground can be revisited. A cave can shelter generations without becoming a town. But Jericho drew people into permanence. The spring gave water, and water gave possibility. Yet water alone does not build towers. Water alone does not gather labor into masonry. Somewhere within the life of this community, practical need and shared belief converged. The people of Jericho learned, or decided, that their survival was tied to a specific patch of earth. The tell preserves that decision. It holds the accumulated weight of those who woke, worked, feared, feasted, mourned, and died there. Their voices are gone, their language is gone, their names are gone, but their presence is undeniable. In the layers of Tel es Sultan, the first great secret of Jericho is not hidden in gold or royal tombs. It is hidden in the stubborn fact of settlement itself. Here, before civilization had hardened into cities of kings and walls of empire, people began to make a world that could outlast a single lifetime. In the deep heat of the Jordan Valley, where the earth sinks far below the level of the sea, and the air can hang motionless over salt, stone, and thorn. Water is never merely water. It is power, it is invitation, it is boundary and blessing. It is the difference between a passing footprint and a human life rooted in place. At Jericho, the spring did not simply nourish the body. It shaped the mind. It gathered people to itself, like a voice rising from beneath the ground. Ein es Sultan, the ancient spring beside the mound, pours from a landscape that otherwise can appear severe and unforgiving. The surrounding country is not lifeless, but it demands knowledge. The slopes westward rise toward the highlands. The Jordan River lies to the east, moving through its long valley toward the Dead Sea. Seasonal plants appear and vanish. Animals follow patterns of grazing, shelter, and migration. Rainfall varies sharply across short distances. In such a place, survival belongs to those who can read the world with precision. The first settlers of Jericho were not helpless wanderers saved by accident. They were expert observers of climate, plants, stone, animal behavior, and water. To understand why Jericho mattered, we must enter the centuries after the last great ice age began to loosen its grip. The world was changing. Glaciers far to the north withdrew. Sea levels rose, forests shifted, grasslands expanded and contracted. Rainbelts moved, species adapted, migrated, or vanished. Human communities, already ancient beyond imagining, watched familiar landscapes transform around them. The end of the Pleistocene was not a single gentle warming. It was an age of instability, a long threshold between old worlds and new. Within that wider upheaval came the Younger Dryas, a cold and dry climatic reversal that began around 12,900 years ago and lasted for more than 1,000 years. Across parts of Southwest Asia, this shift may have placed pressure on wild food resources. Communities that had once moved through rich territories may have faced shrinking options, harsher seasonal uncertainty, or greater competition around reliable water and plant zones. The old freedom of movement did not disappear overnight, but the logic of survival changed. A permanent spring in a difficult landscape became more than useful. It became a center of gravity. Imagine the valley at dawn in those unstable centuries. Mist lifting faintly near the water, birds gathering in reeds, gazelle moving beyond the settlement edge, people stepping from low houses into light. They knew which plants ripened first, where tubers could be dug, which stones fractured into blades, which paths led toward game, which clouds promised rain, and which silence warned of danger. They lived in conversation with the environment, not as spectators, but as participants. Their knowledge was not written, but it was deep. tested, inherited, corrected by hunger, and confirmed by survival. The spring made permanence possible, but it did not guarantee ease. Water attracts all life. People were not the only ones drawn there. Animals came, other human groups came, insects gathered. Disease may have found new opportunities where people, animals, refuse, and standing moisture existed in closer relationship. Settlement brought benefit and burden together. A camp could move away from filth, exhaustion, conflict, and death. A community rooted by a spring had to manage its own accumulation. This is one of the hidden revolutions of Jericho. To remain in place is to create problems unknown to the fully mobile camp. Waste must be dealt with. Houses must be maintained. Storage must be protected. Relations between families must be negotiated day after day. The dead remain near the living. Children grow up knowing one place not merely as a stop along the way, but as home. The ground becomes social. The spring becomes political. Access to water, proximity to water, memory of first arrival, labor invested in construction, and claims of ancestry may all begin to matter. The ancient environment also shaped the diet and work of the people. Wild cereals grew in regions of the Levant and were increasingly gathered, processed, and perhaps tended. Cutting grain with stone sickle blades leaves traces. Grinding seeds into flour requires tools and labor. Storing food requires containers, bins, protected spaces, and trust. Even before fully domesticated agriculture became dominant, people could intensify their relationship with plants. They could return to favored stands, clear competing vegetation, harvest selectively, and carry seeds near their dwellings. The line between foraging and farming was not a wall. It was a long, shifting path. In a place like Jericho, that path may have been shaped by both opportunity and anxiety. The oasis gave security, but the surrounding world remained unpredictable. A family that could store grain had a buffer against lean months. A community that could manage plant resources near reliable water had a reason to stay. Yet staying meant deeper dependence on the place itself. The spring, once a gift, became a bond. Climatology gives this story its broad frame, but archaeology gives it texture. Charred plant remains, pollen, phytoliths, sediments, and animal bones each carry faint signals from vanished ecologies. They tell of environments that were never static. They reveal how people adjusted to changing conditions, not through sudden invention alone, but through repeated small decisions, a new harvesting pattern, a repaired floor, a shared storage feature, a path worn between house and spring, a wall built where the open landscape once began. There is something almost mythic in the image of human beings gathering around a spring after a climatic crisis. But it was not myth to them. It was thirst, labor, birth, hunger, argument, ceremony, and survival. The great forces of planetary climate moved beyond their control, yet they responded with intelligence. They did what humans have always done when confronted by uncertainty. They made relationships with water, with plants, with stone, with ancestors, with one another. The spring may also have carried symbolic weight. In many human societies, water emerging from the earth is not treated as an ordinary resource. It belongs to the hidden world below. It appears without visible river or rain. It seems to cross boundaries between realms. For the people of ancient Jericho, we cannot recover the exact beliefs, and we must not pretend certainty where none survives. Yet it is reasonable to wonder whether the spring was more than a practical source. A place that gives life in a harsh basin can easily become a place of reverence. The daily act of drawing water can become ritual through repetition alone. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We cannot hear their songs at the water. We cannot know what names they gave the spring, or whether they imagined spirits in its depths, or ancestors beneath its flow, or powers older than human speech. We have no prayer carved in stone. We have only the stubborn fact that people gathered there and stayed. The landscape of Jericho was never a passive backdrop. It was an active force in the making of one of humanity's earliest settlements. The valley pressed, the climate shifted, the animals moved, the plants ripened, the dry seasons threatened, and the spring endured. Around that endurance, human beings began to build their own. At Jericho, water became memory, memory became place, place became permanence, and permanence began to change the human story forever. Before kings, before pottery, before the carved seal, before the written tablet, before the bronze blade flashed in the sun, there were the people of early Jericho. They lived in a world that is difficult for the modern mind to enter, not because they were simple, but because their world had not yet divided itself into the categories we now carry so easily. Work, ritual, family, death, food, shelter, memory, and belief were likely woven into one fabric. The thread of daily survival may also have been the thread of sacred order. Archaeologists call their age the pre-pottery Neolithic, a term that sounds dry, almost lifeless, but behind it stands one of the great transformations in the long history of our species. Pre-pottery, because fired clay vessels had not yet become part of ordinary life in this region. Neolithic, because new ways of living were taking shape, involving settled communities, cultivated plants, polished stone objects, long-term architecture, and new relationships between people and place. Yet the label can mislead us. It may suggest an unfinished world, a world waiting for later inventions to become complete. But Jericho was not incomplete to those who lived there. It was the center of their known existence. Their houses were built of mud, stone, reed, timber, and plaster, materials gathered from the immediate world and transformed by hand. Early structures were often rounded, with curving walls that seemed to echo older forms of shelter. Such houses were not grand by later standards, but they were meaningful. A house is a claim. A house says that a family expects to wake here again. A house says that labor invested today will matter tomorrow. A house gathers heat, food, tools, memory, and the dead into a protected interior. In the early settlement, architecture was already beginning to shape social life. Think of the daily labor behind even a modest dwelling. Earth must be selected, mixed, shaped, dried, and repaired. Floors must be prepared and renewed. Roof materials must be gathered. Posts must be cut. Stones must be carried. Plaster must be made with heat, water, and skill. Nothing in such a structure is effortless. The home is not a primitive hut thrown together in an afternoon. It is a deliberate construction, maintained across seasons, adapted to need, altered as families grow and shrink. It is a living thing of mud and memory. The people themselves were heirs to the deep hunter-gatherer traditions of the Epipaleolithic and Natufian worlds. Their ancestors had known seasonal movement, wild cereals, gazelle hunting, stone blade production, and the careful use of rich ecological zones. Jericho did not arise from ignorance. It arose from expertise accumulated over thousands of years. To gather wild grain effectively requires timing, tool-making, plant knowledge, storage knowledge, and cooperation. To hunt in a changing landscape requires patience, tracking, communication, courage, and restraint. To settle more permanently did not mean abandoning old knowledge. It meant reorganizing it. Stone tools reveal some of this reorganization. Lithic analysis allows archaeologists to study raw material, manufacture, form, use, and discard. A flint blade is not only a blade. It is evidence of quarrying or exchange, of technical tradition, of hand movement, of learned skill passed from person to person. Some tools cut plants, some scraped hides, some pierced, carved, or processed wood and bone. The careful preparation of cores and removal of blades show that these people possessed fine motor skill and inherited craft knowledge. Their technology was not crude. It was appropriate, elegant, and often astonishingly efficient. Food production and food gathering likely existed together in shifting balance. The people of Jericho occupied a threshold world, where cultivation may have expanded, but older subsistence practices still remained vital. They may have harvested wild cereals, gathered legumes, fruits, and nuts from wider territories, hunted gazelle and other animals, and slowly intensified the care of useful plants. Domestication was not a single event, as though one morning a person invented farming and history changed. It was a long entanglement between humans and species that began to thrive near human hands. This matters because we often imagine the first farmers as people who chose comfort and abundance. But early settlement may not always have been easier than mobility. Farming can be laborious, uncertain, and dangerous. Crops fail. Stored food attracts pests and thieves. Close living can spread disease. A poor harvest can turn a settled community into a trap. The people of Jericho were not simply stepping upward into progress. They were experimenting with a new bargain. The spring and surrounding resources gave them reasons to remain. But permanence demanded discipline. There would have been rhythms to life that are almost invisible archaeologically, yet essential to imagine. The grinding of seed on stone, the soft slap of wet plaster against a wall, the cutting of reeds, the repair of a roof after rain, the sharpening of a blade, the smell of smoke caught inside a dwelling, the murmur of people working near the spring, the cries of infants, the low voices of the old, the tense silence when strangers appeared beyond the settlement edge, the sudden celebration of a successful hunt, the grief of a burial beneath the floor. In such a world, childhood must have looked very different from our own. Yet some things remain unchanged across the ages. Children would have learned by watching. They would have watched adults make tools, prepare food, gather fuel, tend fires, carry water, shape mud, cut plants, and honor the dead. Knowledge lived in bodies. It lived in posture, rhythm, gesture, and memory. A child did not need a written lesson to understand which plants were food, which snakes were dangerous, which elder held authority, which stories belonged to the house, and which places were not to be disturbed. The absence of pottery also shaped domestic life. Without fired clay vessels, storage and cooking relied on other technologies: baskets, skins, Stone containers, wooden bowls, pits, plastered bins, and heated stones may have played important roles. Organic materials rarely survive well in the archaeological record, which means entire worlds of craft can vanish. We must never mistake absence of evidence for absence of invention. A society may be rich in perishable materials and leave little behind but stone, plaster, and bone. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The people of early Jericho also lived with animals in ways that were changing. Some species remained hunted. Others may have moved gradually into closer association with human communities. The management of animals was not necessarily a clean break from hunting. It could involve protecting herds, controlling access to grazing, taking young animals, observing breeding, or returning to the same groups season after season. As with plants, the boundary between wild and domestic was crossed slowly. Human beings did not conquer nature in a single stroke. They entered into relationships with it, and those relationships changed both sides. What kind of society did all this produce? Not a state, not a kingdom, not a city in the later bureaucratic sense, but also not a loose scattering of unrelated families. Jericho required cooperation. Houses clustered together. Construction projects demanded shared labor. Storage and water access required rules, spoken or unspoken. Burials under floors imply strong links between household, ancestry, and place. Such a community needed memory keepers, skilled builders, toolmakers, healers, hunters, gatherers, and perhaps ritual specialists whose authority came not from crowns, but from knowledge. To live before kings was not to live before order. To live before pottery was not to live before culture. The people of Jericho had order, but it may have been personal, ancestral, seasonal, and communal. They had culture, but it was sung, enacted, built, buried, worn, and remembered rather than written. Their world was not a blank preface to civilization. It was a fully human world, strange only because we possess so little of its voice. And so the image sharpens. At the edge of the desert, around a life-giving spring, people without writing or metal or pottery were already creating a settled existence of remarkable complexity. They were not waiting for history to begin. They were making history with mud walls, stone blades, stored grain, buried ancestors, and hands hardened by work. The wall of Jericho stands at the center of one of the oldest arguments in archaeology. It is not merely a structure of stone. It is a challenge to the timeline. It rises from an age when, by every comfortable assumption, such things should not yet have been necessary. No kings are named, no enemy is recorded, no army is described, no inscription explains the purpose. And yet the wall was built, stone upon stone, by human hands at a time when the world was still learning what permanent settlement could mean. The first shock is its scale. This was not a light fence. It was not a casual boundary of brush or timber. It was a substantial construction made from stone, requiring quarrying, transport, shaping, placement, and repair. To build in stone is to commit labor to permanence. Mud can be reshaped, reeds can be replaced, branches can be gathered quickly. But stone carries weight in every sense. It demands bodies, it demands planning, it demands agreement, or authority, or fear strong enough to make many people act as one. Here lies the first great problem. Why would a community so early in the Neolithic world, need such a wall? The simplest answer is defense. Walls keep people out. Later cities built walls against raiders, rival kingdoms, armies, and siege engines. From Mesopotamia to the highlands of Anatolia, from the Nile Valley to the cities of the Mediterranean, fortification became one of the clearest marks of urban life. It separated those inside from danger beyond. It displayed strength. It protected stores, families, livestock, temples, and ruling houses. So perhaps Jericho was also defending itself. But against whom? In 9000 before Christ, the surrounding world was not empty. Human groups moved through valleys, steppe, highlands, and oases. They knew good water when they found it. They knew the value of food, tools, shelter, and stored grain. A settled community beside a permanent spring may have been attractive not only to its own inhabitants, but to outsiders. If stored food existed, it created temptation. If people gathered in one place, conflict could emerge. If the spring mattered in dry seasons, competition over access may have been intense. A wall, in this reading, becomes a response to human pressure. Yet the defensive explanation is not without difficulty. A wall can deter, but it can also symbolize. Its height, thickness, and placement may not correspond neatly to battlefield logic. We must remember that the earliest walls known to archaeology may not always have been built for the reasons later walls were built. To look backward from the age of kings and armies may distort the older world. The people of Jericho did not necessarily think like later city rulers. Their wall may have protected, but it may also have defined, gathered, displayed, or sanctified. Another explanation turns toward the environment. Jericho lies in a landscape where water is life, but water can also threaten. Seasonal floods, runoff from surrounding slopes, erosion, mud flows, and the movement of sediment may have shaped the edges of the settlement. A wall could have served as a barrier against floodwater or debris. It could have protected the inhabited area from environmental damage rather than human attack. In such a dry land, the idea of flood may seem strange to the imagination, yet arid regions often suffer sudden and violent water events when rain falls hard on bare ground. A settlement near springs and channels may have needed control as much as access. This theory has power because it places the wall within the practical intelligence of the inhabitants. They were not simply afraid of enemies. They were engineers of survival. They observed the landscape across seasons. They knew where water moved after storms. They understood which edges of the settlement were vulnerable. A wall may have been an attempt to tame the forces that made settlement possible and dangerous at the same time. But even here, the mystery remains. If the wall was purely practical, why did it become so monumental? Why build so heavily, so visibly? Why place so much communal labor into a boundary that must have changed the psychological experience of the settlement itself? Once built, the wall would have altered everything. It would have shaped paths of entry and exit. It would have framed the view from inside. It would have made the community conscious of itself as a community. The wall did not merely respond to Jericho. It helped create Jericho. A wall changes the human mind. Before a wall, a settlement fades outward into the landscape. Houses, paths, activity zones, hearths, and working spaces blend into the surrounding world. But a wall draws a line. Inside and outside become ideas. people begin to experience belonging spatially. To sleep within the wall is different from sleeping beyond it. To control an entrance is to control movement, news, goods, and strangers. To repair a wall together is to repeat the lesson that survival depends on collective labor. A wall is architecture, but it is also social grammar. The people of Jericho may not have had kings, yet the wall hints at organization beyond the household. No single family would likely raise such a structure alone. The project required coordination. Someone had to decide where it would run. Someone had to organize stone procurement. Someone had to feed workers or arrange labor around seasonal tasks. Someone had to maintain momentum when bodies grew tired and hands were cut by rock. This does not prove a ruler in the later sense. It does prove a community capable of directing energy toward a shared purpose. That purpose may have been wrapped in meaning. In ancient societies, boundaries often hold symbolic force. A line around a settlement can mark separation from wilderness, spirits, disease, the dead, enemies, animals, or chaos itself. It can protect not only bodies, but identity. It can say, "Here is our place, our dead, our water, our memory, our food, our children, our ancestors. Beyond lies the uncertain world." The wall may have been a stone sentence spoken to the landscape. We should not imagine the work as silent. Construction would have filled Jericho with sound. Stones grinding against stones, voices calling instructions, breath under weight, the dull thud of rock placed into position, dust rising from the wall face, children watching, elders remembering why the labor mattered, injuries treated, meals shared, arguments settled or left unresolved. In building the wall, the people may have learned new forms of cooperation. The wall may have trained society into being more complex. This is the paradigm-breaking power of Jericho. Monumental labor appears before the bureaucratic state. Collective architecture appears before writing. Social coordination appears before the institutions we usually associate with civilization. The wall suggests that the roots of urban life lie not only in administration and agriculture, but in shared crisis, shared memory, and shared imagination. People may have built together before they ruled each other. Still, the wall refuses to give one answer. Defense, flood control, status, ritual, identity, and social cohesion may all have mingled. Modern categories divide what ancient experience may have held together. A wall against water could also be a wall against disorder. A defensive structure could also be sacred. A practical boundary could become ancestral. Once generations live beside it, repair it, bury their dead near it, and tell stories about its making. The original reason may dissolve into tradition. The stones do not speak plainly. They never have. They give shape without confession. They show effort, but not motive. They reveal ability, but not intention. And so we stand before the wall, answerless, adrift to ponder. What we can say is this: at Jericho, around 11,000 years ago, human beings transformed the edge of their settlement with stone. In doing so, they created one of the earliest known architectural boundaries of communal life. Whether raised against enemies, floods, fear, or the unseen powers of the world, the wall marked a turning point. It announced that this place mattered enough to be enclosed. It announced that the people within had become something more than a gathering of households. They had become a community with a boundary, and in that boundary we glimpse one of the first shadows of the city. The Tower of Jericho rises from the imagination like something that should belong to a later world. It is massive, circular, stone-built, and ancient beyond comfort. It was not the tower of a medieval fortress. It was not the tower of a king. It was not the watchtower of a written empire guarding a road of commerce. It was raised in the early Neolithic, at a time when pottery was absent, metal tools were unknown, and the first experiments in settled life were still being tested beneath a hard sun. And yet there it was, a stone tower, broad at its base, rising above the settlement edge, with an internal staircase ascending through its body. This detail matters. A pile of stones can be accidental. A circular mass can be rubble misunderstood. But a staircase is intention made visible. Steps are built for movement. They guide the body upward. They create sequence, rhythm, approach, and arrival. Whoever built the tower did not merely stack stone. They imagined people passing through it, climbing within it, entering darkness and emerging higher than before. That alone should make us pause. The construction of such a tower required more than strength. It required measurement, planning, and the ability to hold a form in mind before it fully existed. The builders had to select stones, prepare the foundation, maintain the curve, and ensure stability. They had to create a stairway that could bear human weight. They had to coordinate the labor of many individuals over time. One person might dream of a tower, but one person could not easily bring this tower into being alone. It was a communal act, a gathering of hands around a shared vision. What vision? The oldest and most practical interpretation is that the tower served a defensive purpose. If a wall marked the boundary of the settlement, a tower could strengthen it. A raised structure might offer a vantage point across the surrounding landscape. From its summit, one could watch movement near the spring, along approaches, across the valley floor, or toward the rising slopes beyond. In a world without written warning, the eye was the first alarm. A tower could turn sight into security, but the evidence does not settle so easily. The tower's interior staircase suggests controlled access, perhaps ceremonial movement, perhaps a particular kind of experience. Its position, mass, and antiquity have led scholars to imagine purposes beyond defense. It may have stood as a monument to collective identity, a symbol of belonging, or even a ritual structure connected to cycles of light, death, and renewal. Some have proposed that its form and placement may have related to celestial events, to the setting sun, to the mountain horizon, or to the ordering of time itself. We must tread carefully. The temptation to fill silence with certainty is strong. Ancient towers invite modern dreams. Yet even without absolute interpretation, the structure tells us something profound. The people of Jericho could imagine verticality. They could build not only outward across the ground, but upward into space. In a flat settlement of low houses, the tower would have changed the skyline. It would have risen above daily life. It would have been seen from within, and perhaps from afar. It would have given Jericho a face. A tower is not like a house. A house belongs primarily to those who sleep inside it. A tower belongs to the community, or to those who control the community, or to the powers the community believes must be honored. It is public in a way domestic architecture is not. Its meaning cannot be contained within one family. The Tower of Jericho, therefore, points toward shared imagination. It suggests that people who lived in small rooms of mud and plaster could also think in monumental terms. Imagine the construction day after day. A group moves toward a quarry or stone source. Blocks are loosened and carried. Some are dragged. Some are lifted by several people together. Dust settles into hair and skin. The heat becomes oppressive. Hands bleed. Voices coordinate effort. Water is brought from the spring. Food is prepared for workers. Children stare at the rising form and grow up believing it has always been there. Even as older people remember the first foundation stones, the tower becomes not only a finished object, but an event stretched across months, seasons, perhaps years. Such labor can create society as much as express it. A project this large demands cooperation among households that may otherwise have separate interests. It can settle disputes by binding people into shared work, or it can expose tensions over who commands, who carries, who benefits, and who remembers. The tower may have helped organize time. Certain days may have been devoted to building. Certain individuals may have gained prestige through skill, strength, knowledge, or ritual authority. A person who knew how to align stones, manage labor, or speak meaning over construction could become important without ever becoming a king. The inner staircase remains the heart of the mystery. To climb within stone is to experience confinement and ascent. The body leaves the open settlement and enters a narrow passage. Light changes, sound changes, the air cools or stills, footsteps echo. The climber rises step by step, enclosed by the work of many hands. At the top, the world opens again. The houses lie below. The spring glints. The valley spreads outward. The mountains hold the horizon. Such an experience could be practical, but it could also be transformative. Human beings have always made meaning through movement. Entering, crossing, descending, climbing, circling, and emerging can become ritual long before words are written down. The tower may have turned the body into a participant in a story. Perhaps selected people climbed it at certain moments. Perhaps watchers used it daily. Perhaps elders stood above the settlement to speak. Perhaps no single explanation is enough. Perhaps its function changed as generations reinterpreted what they inherited. This is the difficulty of ancient architecture. Buildings can outlive the intentions of their builders. A structure raised for one purpose may gain another. A tower first used for lookout could become ancestral. A monument first tied to ritual could become practical. A staircase once climbed by workers could later be climbed by leaders, mourners, watchers, or children playing beneath the gaze of adults who warned them away. Stone holds form, but meaning moves. The tower also forces us to reconsider power. Without written records, we do not know who directed construction, yet the project implies some mechanism of coordination. Was it elder authority, ritual persuasion, seasonal obligation, collective decision, fear of outsiders, reverence for ancestors? The tower stands at the point where social organization becomes visible but not legible. We can see that people acted together. We cannot see the conversations that made them act. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The tower does not tell us whether songs accompanied its construction. It does not tell us whether offerings were placed within its stones. It does not tell us whether the people feared attack, flood, darkness, spirits, or forgetting. It only remains ancient and silent, one of the earliest monumental stone structures known from human prehistory, and that silence is part of its power. At Jericho, Human beings built upward before history had names for architects. They raised stone into the sky before kings claimed the right to command monuments. They created a structure that demanded cooperation, memory, and imagination. The tower was not simply a feature of the settlement. It was an announcement that something new had entered the human world. The earth was no longer only a place to walk, hunt, gather, and sleep. It had become a place from which human beings could rise. The houses of ancient Jericho bring the great mystery down from stone monuments into the breath of ordinary life. It is one thing to speak of walls and towers, of collective labor and the birth of settlement, but another to kneel in the dust and imagine the inside of a home, there in the packed earth and plastered floor, in the curve of a wall, in the ashes of a hearth, in the worn places where feet passed day after day. The first town becomes human. The earliest dwellings were not palaces, not temples, not halls of rulers, but small domestic spaces shaped by need, skill, and memory. Many were rounded or oval in plan, with walls rising from materials drawn directly from the landscape. Mud was shaped and set. Stones were arranged where strength was needed. Reeds, branches, and perhaps timber formed roofs and supports. The buildings were humble in appearance, but their meaning was enormous. To build a house meant a family had begun to trust time. A mobile shelter answers the question of tonight. A permanent house answers the question of years. Inside such a dwelling, life would have been intimate. Space was limited. Smoke from hearths may have darkened interiors. Tools hung or rested near walls. Baskets, skins, wooden objects, and woven containers may have filled corners now emptied by decay. Grinding stones lay where grain or seeds were processed. Children slept close to adults. Food was prepared. Stories were spoken. Wounds were treated. Arguments rose and faded. A house contained both tenderness and tension. It was not only shelter from the elements. It was the stage upon which family life repeated itself until it became ancestry. The plastered floors are especially revealing. A plaster floor is not casual. It requires preparation, mixture, labor, and maintenance. It creates a clean surface, a deliberate interior, a place separated from raw earth. To renew a floor is to renew the house itself. Floors can be laid over earlier floors, sealing traces of previous activity below. In this way, domestic architecture grows downward as well as upward. Beneath the feet of the living, older lives remain pressed into the mound. Imagine a woman grinding grain near the morning light. The motion is repetitive, heavy, and skilled, stone against stone, seed becoming meal. The sound joins the settlement chorus, voices, footsteps, animal cries, the stirring of fires, water carried from the spring nearby. A child watches and learns the rhythm without formal instruction. Elsewhere, someone repairs a wall after rain has softened its face. Another person sharpens a flint blade. Another sorts plants gathered from beyond the settlement edge. Life is not a single dramatic event. It is accumulation. Archaeology often finds the broken things, but broken things are sometimes the most honest witnesses. A chipped blade discarded after use, a grinding stone worn hollow by countless motions, a hearth stained by heat, a post hole marking where a roof once stood, a patch of repaired plaster. These are not treasures in the royal sense, but they are treasures of a deeper kind. They reveal endurance. They tell us that human beings were doing what human beings have always done, making order inside uncertainty. The rounded form of many early houses may preserve older habits of movement and shelter. Curving walls can create a sense of enclosure without sharp corners. They may reflect traditions carried from earlier semi-permanent or mobile lifeways. Later, rectangular architecture would become more common in many Neolithic communities, allowing rooms to be added and buildings to fit together more efficiently. But the rounded houses of early Jericho belong to a threshold age, when old forms and new commitments met in mud and plaster. The settlement itself must have been dense compared with a seasonal camp. Houses stood near one another. Paths ran between them. Sounds traveled easily. Privacy, as modern people understand it, may have been limited. Everyone knew who was sick, who had food, who quarreled, who mourned, who failed to contribute, who carried water, who received visitors. In such proximity, social rules mattered. A permanent community cannot survive on resources alone. It must manage relationships. The house was also a place where the living and the dead could remain bound together. Burials beneath floors are among the most powerful signs of early Neolithic domestic life. The dead were not always sent far away to separate cemeteries. They could remain under the household surface beneath the daily movement of descendants. This closeness is difficult for many modern minds, but in ancient Jericho it may have made perfect sense. The house was not only a shelter for living bodies, it was a vessel of lineage. To live above the dead is to inhabit memory physically. Every meal, every sleep, every repair of a wall takes place over those who came before. Ancestors become part of architecture. The floor becomes a boundary between breath and bone. Perhaps the presence of the dead strengthened claims to a house or plot of land. Perhaps it comforted the living. Perhaps it carried obligations. Perhaps it created a spiritual geography within the home itself, with certain places charged by memory and care. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know the words spoken at burial. We do not know whether the dead were feared, loved, invoked, or consulted. We do not know whether children were told the exact resting places beneath them. We do not know whether each household preserved its own stories across generations, or whether memory blurred and ancestors became a collective presence, nameless but powerful. Domestic life also reveals the labor of maintenance, a subject easily ignored because it lacks spectacle. Settled life is repair. Roofs leak, walls crack, floors wear, vermin enter stored food. Fire damages interiors. Rain and heat attack mud surfaces. People must sweep, patch, rebuild, replace, clean, and reorganize. A town is not built once. It is built continuously, every day. The inhabitants of Jericho had to keep permanence from collapsing back into earth. This work may have shaped gender, age, and status, though the evidence cannot be forced into simple categories. Some individuals may have specialized in tool-making, plaster production, building, plant processing, healing, hunting, or ritual care of the dead. Elders may have held knowledge of house histories and kinship ties. Skilled hands may have earned respect through repeated usefulness. In a world without written titles, reputation lived in action. The sensory world of the houses deserves attention. The smell of damp plaster, the grit of ground grain, the warmth of a hearth, the touch of a smooth floor under bare feet, the dimness of interiors at midday, the glow of fire at night, the sound of breathing bodies in a small room, the sudden quiet after death, the low murmur of memory when the floor was opened and a body was placed beneath it. Here, civilization begins not with splendor, but with nearness. The houses of Jericho remind us that the first experiments in town life were not abstract developments in a textbook. They were lived by people who woke in crowded rooms, cared for children, feared hunger, honored the dead, and repaired the same walls again and again. Their world was made of modest spaces, but those spaces carried enormous meaning. In mud and plaster, they built more than shelter. They built belonging beneath the floors of ancient Jericho, below the places where people slept, ate, worked, argued, and dreamed. The dead remained close. They were not always banished to distant burial grounds, nor hidden away beyond the edge of settlement. They lay within the living space itself, sealed beneath plaster and earth, folded into the architecture of home. In this closeness, one of the most haunting features of the early Neolithic world begins to appear. The house was not only a shelter, it was a vessel of memory, and in some cases a dwelling for the ancestors as much as for the living. Among the most extraordinary discoveries associated with Neolithic Jericho are the plastered skulls. Human skulls, separated from bodies after death, were carefully modeled with plaster to recreate facial features. Shells or other materials could be set into the eye sockets. The result was neither a simple bone nor a portrait in the modern sense, but something between person, relic, image, and presence. These skulls look back at us across nearly 10,000 years with an unsettling intimacy. To encounter one is to feel the collapse of distance. The face is not alive, yet it is not merely dead. The plaster gives the skull a surface again. Cheeks return. A nose is shaped. Eyes are restored in symbolic form. Someone has touched the head with care. Someone has remembered the contours of a human being, or at least the idea of a human being. The dead have been transformed into an object of attention, perhaps reverence, perhaps authority, perhaps love. This practice was not unique to Jericho, but Jericho helped reveal its antiquity and power. Across parts of the early Neolithic Near East, the treatment of skulls suggests complex relationships with ancestors. Heads could be removed after burial, curated, displayed, reburied, or remodeled. The skull, seat of face, identity, speech, sight, and memory, carried special significance. To preserve or recreate the head was to hold on to more than bone. It was to hold on to personhood. Why did they do it? One explanation is ancestor veneration. In a settled community, ancestry becomes deeply important. The dead connect the living to place. A household that keeps its ancestors beneath the floor can claim continuity. A family that curates skulls may be saying, "We belong here because our dead belong here." In a world where land, water, and houses increasingly mattered across generations, memory could become a form of social power. The ancestor was not only mourned, the ancestor authorized. This does not mean the practice was cold or political alone. Grief must be given its place. Imagine the death of an elder, someone whose knowledge held the seasons, the paths, the edible plants, the stories of houses, the relationships between families. The body is buried. Time passes. Later, the skull is retrieved. The face is modeled. The eyes are set. The person returns in a changed form, silent yet present. This could be an act of mourning, a way to keep the beloved near in a world where permanence was still new and loss remained as devastating as ever. But the plastered skulls may also speak to fear. The dead are powerful in many human traditions. They bless, protect, warn, accuse, or trouble the living. Keeping ancestors close may have required ritual control. The skull could embody a presence that had to be cared for properly. Neglect might invite disorder. Attention might secure protection. In this sense, the plastered head is both intimate and dangerous, both family and force. The artistry of the skulls deserves careful thought. These were not careless modifications. Plaster had to be prepared, shaped, smoothed, and applied. The human face had to be understood as form. Even if the modeled features were not exact likenesses, they show a concern with appearance, identity, and representation. This is not art for decoration alone. It is art bound to death, memory, and social meaning. It reveals a people capable of abstraction and emotional depth. The act of separating the skull from the body also suggests a staged relationship with death. Death was not a single moment after which the body vanished from concern. It could involve phases: burial, decay, retrieval, remodeling, display, reburial. Each phase may have had ceremonies, restrictions, and participants. Certain individuals may have held knowledge of how to handle the dead. This possibility hints at ritual specialists, people whose authority lay in their ability to mediate between the living community and its ancestors. Such rites could also bind households together. Imagine a gathering in which a plastered skull is brought out, placed within a domestic space, or used during a ceremony tied to inheritance, harvest, construction, healing, or conflict resolution. The ancestor would not need to speak to be influential. Its presence alone could remind everyone of obligations older than any living person. The dead could become witnesses, yet we must not flatten the mystery. Not every skull was plastered. Not every person received the same treatment. This inequality may reveal differences in age, status, gender, lineage, ritual role, or circumstance of death. Some individuals became ancestral presences, others did not. The selection matters, but its rules remain hidden. Who chose? Who was chosen? Who was denied? These questions lie beneath the plastered faces, answerless, adrift to ponder. The placement of the dead beneath homes also changes the meaning of domestic space. The floor becomes a membrane. Above it, cooking, sleeping, birth, repair, and conversation. Below it, bodies, bones, memory, and perhaps power. A person moving across the house may have known exactly where a parent or grandparent rested, or perhaps, after generations, the precise identities blurred, and the house itself became ancestral. The building carried the dead collectively, its floor thick with former lives. This closeness between living and dead may have helped stabilize settlement. A mobile group can remember ancestors through story, landscape, and portable objects. A settled group can root ancestors in architecture. The home becomes a shrine without ceasing to be a home. The town becomes a field of remembered bodies. Leaving such a place would not be like leaving a camp. It would mean leaving the dead behind. Permanence becomes emotional, spiritual, and social. The plastered skulls also force us to reconsider the origins of representation. Long before royal statues and written names, people created faces of the dead. These were not portraits of rulers carved for public domination. They were human heads, recreated in a community still close to foraging traditions. The impulse to represent may have grown not only from power, but from grief. The first faces preserved in plaster may have been born from the refusal to let the dead disappear entirely. There is a deep human truth here. We are creatures who remember faces. We seek them in clouds, stones, flames, and dreams. We fear their absence. We keep images of those we love. We speak to the dead when no one is listening. The people of Jericho did not have photographs, inscriptions, or written genealogies. They had bone, plaster, shell, and touch. With these, they made memory visible. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know whether the plastered skulls were kept in dark corners or displayed in moments of ceremony. We do not know whether they belonged to founders, elders, healers, mothers, hunters, or ritual leaders. We do not know whether their faces were meant to resemble the dead or to transform them into something greater. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. What remains is the power of the gesture. At Jericho, the dead were not simply gone. They continued to participate in the life of the settlement. They lay beneath floors. They reappeared as faces. They shaped belonging, memory, and perhaps authority. Their presence reminds us that the birth of settled life was not only an economic revolution, it was a spiritual one. The first town was built not only by the living, it was built upon the dead. At Jericho, survival was measured in seeds, blades, hands, seasons, and the uncertain patience of the earth. Long before fields stretched in ordered rows across the landscapes of later kingdoms, the people of the early settlement were learning how deeply their fate could become tied to plants. Grain was not simply food. It was labor stored in small, hard bodies. It was risk made visible. It was a promise that might fail. The great change from foraging to farming was not a single invention, and it didn't arrive like a door opening suddenly in the dark. It was slower, stranger, and more human than that. For thousands of years, communities across the Levant had gathered wild cereals, pulses, nuts, fruits, and other useful plants with extraordinary knowledge. They understood ripening times, soil, rainfall, slopes, animal competition, and the fragile difference between abundance and famine. Early cultivation emerged from this deep expertise. It was not the work of ignorant people discovering nature for the first time. It was the work of specialists who already knew the living world intimately. The inhabitants of Jericho lived during a threshold age when older ways of gathering and newer forms of plant management overlapped. The spring allowed people to remain in one place longer than mobile life might otherwise permit. Settlement encouraged storage. Storage encouraged planning. Planning encouraged closer observation of plant growth near the community. Over generations, certain grains may have been favored, tended, protected, harvested, and replanted. Human choice began to press gently but persistently upon plant evolution. Archaeobotany gives us clues to this slow transformation. Charred seeds, impressions, pollen, phytoliths, and residues can reveal what people gathered, ate, stored, or processed. These traces are small, often invisible to the untrained eye, but they carry enormous weight. A carbonized grain recovered from a floor or pit may seem insignificant beside a tower of stone, yet it can speak to diet, season, cultivation, and economy. In the story of Jericho, a seed can be as monumental as a wall. The sickle blade is another witness. Flint tools used for cutting cereals often develop a distinctive gloss along their edges, created by repeated contact with silica-rich plant stems. Lithic analysis can identify such wear, allowing archaeologists to reconstruct actions that vanished thousands of years ago. The hand is gone. The harvest song, if there was one, is gone. The field or wild stand is gone, but the blade remembers the motion, cut after cut, season after season, human muscle entering into rhythm with plant life. Think of the harvest itself. People moving through stands of grain under a hot sky, stalks gathered in one hand, cut with a curved sickle set with small flint inserts, dust rising from dry earth, seeds shaken loose, carried in baskets, dried, sorted, stored, ground, cooked. The process required coordination and timing. Harvest too early, and the grain is immature. Harvest too late, and seed drops to the ground or is eaten by birds and animals. To live by grain is to enter into negotiation with time. Storage changed everything. A hunter returning with meat brings immediate abundance, but meat must be consumed, dried, shared, or preserved. Grain can wait. Grain can be hidden. Grain can be counted, protected, inherited, stolen, offered, or controlled. It creates a future inside the present. It allows a community to survive lean seasons, but it also introduces new tensions. Who owns what is stored? Who guards it? Who receives food when harvests fail? Who decides what seed must be saved for planting rather than eaten by hungry mouths? In such questions, we may glimpse the first pressures that led human societies toward new forms of order. Not necessarily kings, not yet taxation, not written bureaucracy, but rules, social expectations, obligations between households, shared granaries or household storage, feasting and redistribution, the moral weight of hunger. A person with stored food becomes powerful in a season of scarcity. A community with collective storage becomes more resilient, but also more dependent on trust. Grinding stones reveal the cost of this new food world. Grain does not become bread or porridge by magic. It must be processed, husks removed, seeds crushed, flour produced. The work is repetitive and physically demanding. Skeletons from early farming populations often show signs of bodily strain, dental wear, and changes associated with new diets. Agriculture was not effortless progress. It asked much from the human body. It increased food supply in some contexts, but it also deepened labor and dependence. This is one of the great paradoxes of the Neolithic. People may have worked harder as they became more settled. They may have eaten less varied diets in some seasons. They may have lived closer to waste, pests, and disease. Yet the new way endured and expanded. Why? Because settlement, storage, population growth, ritual, ancestry, and food production became entangled. Once, a community had houses, dead beneath floors, stored grain, and children born into one place. Leaving was no longer simple. Farming was not only a technology, it was a trap, a promise, and a transformation. At Jericho, seeds and sickles must be understood alongside hunting. The people did not abandon the wider world beyond the settlement. Gazelle and other animals remained important. Hunting provided meat, hides, bones, horn, and social prestige. It also maintained older knowledge of landscapes beyond the spring. A community tied to plants did not cease to be a community of trackers, walkers, observers, and skilled tool users. The old world lived on inside the new. The relationship with animals may also have been shifting. In the broader Neolithic of the region, sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs would eventually become central to human economies in different places and times. But domestication was not simply possession. It required changed attitudes toward movement, breeding, protection, slaughter, and territory. Managing animals meant thinking beyond the immediate kill. It meant allowing life to continue so that future life could be controlled. This was a profound change in human relationships with other beings. Food also carried meaning beyond calories. Grain can be cooked for daily meals, but it can also be used in gatherings, rites, offerings, and displays of generosity. A feast is never only consumption. It creates bonds, obligations, memories, and hierarchies. In a world without written contracts, feeding others could be a way to gain influence. A successful harvest could be celebrated. A failed harvest could become a crisis of faith, leadership, and blame. The first politics may have begun around food long before councils, palaces, or written laws. The spring-fed environment of Jericho made experimentation possible, but uncertainty never vanished. Rainfall could fail, wild stands could shrink, stored grain could spoil, insects and rodents could invade, disease could damage crops, human conflict could interrupt harvest. The people who lived here were not marching confidently toward civilization. They were gambling with permanence. Every season judged the experiment. Still, they persisted. They cut grain with flint. They ground seed on stone. They carried baskets. They repaired storage spaces. They taught children when plants were ready. They watched the sky. They listened for signs of weather. They combined old foraging wisdom with new forms of care. Through countless small acts, they helped create one of the most significant changes in human history. And still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We cannot know the names of their plants as they spoke them. We cannot hear the jokes exchanged during harvest, the arguments over storage, the prayers whispered over seed, or the grief of a season that failed. We cannot know which hands first scattered grain near the settlement with intention, or whether anyone understood that they were changing the future of the species. But the evidence remains in fragments: a glossy blade, a charred seed, a worn grinding stone, a storage pit, a plastered floor dusted once with meal. These are the quiet artifacts of revolution. At Jericho, civilization did not begin only in stone. It began in the hand that cut the stalk, the back bent over the quern, the basket filled against winter, and the decision to trust that the earth would give again. To imagine Jericho without a crown is difficult, because later history teaches us to look for rulers wherever stone has been moved on a grand scale. We see a wall, and we look for a king. We see a tower, and we look for command. We see labor organized beyond the household, and our minds turn at once toward chiefs, priests, overseers, guards, and those who stood above others. But the earliest settlement at Jericho resists such simple answers. It shows cooperation without leaving the clear face of authority behind. There is no royal tomb from this earliest age, no throne room, no carved name, no image of a ruler smiting enemies, no tablets listing grain owed to a palace, no seal impressed upon clay to mark official control. The usual signs of institutional power are absent, and yet the settlement itself demands organization. Houses clustered together. Food was gathered, processed, and stored. Burials were placed beneath floors. Plaster was made. Stone was carried. Architecture was maintained. The wall and tower required people to act in concert. The question is not whether there was social order. The question is what kind of order existed when kings had not yet appeared. One possibility is that early Jericho was organized through households. Families, extended kin groups, and lineages may have formed the basic units of society. Each household controlled its own dwelling, tools, storage, and ancestral dead. Cooperation may have emerged through agreements between such groups, negotiated through marriage, exchange, obligation, and shared ritual. In this model, power did not sit in a palace. It moved through relationships. It lived in who owed whom, who remembered what, who had married into which family, who controlled access to labor, and who could call upon ancestors with authority. Such power leaves fewer monuments to itself than kingship does, but it can be deeply effective. A respected elder may not need a throne to influence decisions. A skilled ritual figure may not need guards to command attention. A household with surplus grain may not need soldiers to gain leverage. A builder who understands stone, plaster, and drainage may become indispensable. A hunter who knows distant paths may shape the settlement's connection to the wider world. Influence can be distributed, situational and personal. This is where we must treat the people of Jericho as intellectually and socially sophisticated. They did not require written law to regulate life. Human beings lived for hundreds of thousands of years with custom, memory, shame, praise, generosity, threat, kinship, and story as the instruments of order. A small society can be governed by reputation more effectively than by decree. Everyone knows who breaks promises. Everyone knows who shares food. Everyone knows who works, who avoids work, who heals, who quarrels, who remembers the dead properly, and who can speak when others fall silent. The presence of communal architecture may suggest moments when ordinary household life had to be interrupted by collective labor. How was that labor summoned? Perhaps through seasonal gatherings, when food was available and work could be organized after harvest or during periods of reduced hunting pressure. Perhaps through obligations attached to residence, where each household contributed workers for construction and repair. Perhaps through ritual events, when building was not merely labor, but ceremony. The carrying of stone may have been accompanied by songs, feasts, offerings, or ancestral invocations. Work and worship may have been inseparable. There may also have been competition. A settled community is not automatically peaceful. Families living close together can cooperate, but they can also dispute space, marriage, food, water, burial rights, access to tools, and obligations of labor. The more permanent the settlement, the more difficult it becomes to escape conflict by moving away. Social mechanisms must grow stronger. Mediation becomes vital. Elders, respected households, ritual specialists, or councils may emerge not as rulers in the later sense, but as necessary stabilizers. A council of elders is often imagined in such early communities, and it is plausible, though not directly visible in the soil. Age matters in societies where memory is an archive. The oldest people remember droughts, floods, alliances, deaths, migrations, and the histories of houses. They know who is kin and who is not. They know which families once helped and which once betrayed. They hold practical knowledge of plants, animals, building materials, and ceremonies. In a world without writing, age can be a library, but youth also mattered. Strong bodies carried stones, hunted animals, cut reeds, repaired roofs, and defended the settlement if danger came. The old may remember, but the young act. Tension between memory and strength is one of the oldest human political realities. A society like Jericho may have balanced age, skill, lineage, and labor in ways that did not produce a single ruler, but still produced hierarchy. The plastered skulls complicate the picture further. If some ancestors were treated with special care and others were not, then social distinction existed in death, and perhaps in life. Those chosen for skull removal and plastering may have belonged to important lineages, founding families, ritual roles, or individuals of unusual status. A household that possessed the face of a revered ancestor may have held moral authority. The dead could become political actors, not by speaking, but by being present. This would make authority ancestral rather than royal. Power would come from depth in place. The family that could say, "Our dead lie beneath this floor. Our ancestors were here when the first stones were set. Our lineage belongs to the spring," might have stronger claims than a newcomer or weaker household. In such a world, memory is not gentle. Memory can include exclusion. Belonging can create outsiders. The first forms of inequality may have grown not only from wealth, but from ancestry. Yet we must not rush to make Jericho a miniature kingdom. The lack of obvious elite residences is important. If a powerful ruling class existed, it did not leave the kinds of separation visible in later urban societies. The houses do not clearly reveal palaces towering over common dwellings. The settlement may have held differences, but those differences may have been subtle compared with later civilizations. Power may have been negotiated rather than imposed. Status may have been earned, inherited, contested, and limited. The people of Jericho also lived within a moral world very different from the administrative systems of later states. Their rules may have been embedded in ceremony, food sharing, burial practice, and daily expectation. To refuse communal work might not bring imprisonment, but it could bring shame, isolation, loss of marriage partners, denial of support, or ritual danger. In small societies, the social body itself can discipline. No prison is needed when everyone knows your name and remembers your failures. The tower and wall therefore become evidence not only of labor, but of trust. However imperfectly, people agreed enough to build together. They accepted some form of coordination. They believed the result mattered. The purpose may have been defense, water control, ritual, identity, or all of these braided together. But the social fact remains. Jericho's people could convert many separate human lives into a single architectural act. That conversion is one of the beginnings of politics. Not politics as speeches, elections, courts, or kingship. Politics in the oldest sense, the art of living together, deciding together, compelling together, remembering together, and surviving conflict without destroying the group. Jericho shows us a society experimenting with permanence, and permanence requires rules. It requires limits. It requires shared stories powerful enough to make individuals accept burdens for something larger than themselves. Still, for the most part, Secrets remain hidden. We cannot hear the debates. We cannot identify the first speaker who urged construction. We cannot know whether decisions were made by elders, families, ritual specialists, builders, or a gathering of all. We cannot know whether some resisted, whether some were forced, whether some gained power by claiming to speak for ancestors, water, or unseen forces beneath the earth. But we can say this: Jericho did not need a crown to possess complexity. It did not need writing to possess memory. It did not need a palace to coordinate labor. Its society may have been woven from kinship, ritual, skill, storage, age, and ancestral presence. Its order may have been quiet, intimate, and powerful, precisely because it lived in every household. Before kings commanded cities, communities learned how to command themselves. The wall and tower of Jericho have always stood beneath a cloud of unanswered questions. Their stones are real, their scale is real, their antiquity is real, but their purpose remains suspended between the practical and the sacred. Were they built against enemies, against water, against fear, against memory, against the invisible forces that pressed upon the minds of people living at the edge of a new human age? The deeper one looks, the less satisfying any single answer becomes. The first possibility is fear of other people. A settled community beside a spring would have been visible, valuable, and vulnerable. In a world where most groups still moved through landscapes of seasonal resources, a permanent place with water, stored food, tools, and shelter may have attracted attention. Human beings are cooperative, but they are also dangerous. Scarcity sharpens desire. Drought turns neighbors into rivals. A wall could have been built because Jericho had something worth taking. The inhabitants may have watched strangers approach across the valley floor or along the tracks leading from higher ground. Not armies in the later sense, not soldiers in bronze armor, not organized states clashing over territory, but small bands of people whose intentions could not be known from a distance. Were they kin? Traders, travelers, hunters, hungry outsiders. A settlement that could not move away from danger needed other ways to manage it. Stone offered confidence, height offered warning, entrances offered control. Yet a defensive wall in such an early period raises another question. If conflict existed, what form did it take? Raiding may have been seasonal, opportunistic, and personal. Violence could arise from revenge, marriage disputes, stolen food, access to water, or the killing of animals. The wall need not imply constant warfare. It may imply uncertainty. A boundary can be built not because attack is inevitable, but because the fear of attack has become socially powerful enough to organize labor. Fear alone, however, may not explain the form. Environmental protection deserves equal attention. Jericho's setting, for all its promise, could be hazardous. Water emerging from the earth sustains life, but water moving across the surface can damage it. Sudden rains in arid landscapes can send runoff rushing toward low ground. Channels shift, sediment accumulates. Mud and debris move with surprising violence. A wall may have helped protect the settlement edge from flood, erosion, or seasonal wash. What appears to the eye as fortification may also have been an act of hydrological intelligence. This interpretation gives the builders a different kind of genius. They were not merely reacting to human enemies. They were reading the landscape over years, perhaps generations. They knew where water came from after storms, where the ground softened, where damage repeated, where houses were threatened. The wall could have been part of a broader strategy for making settlement possible in an unstable environment. A community that remains in one place must learn to defend itself from nature as well as from people. But practical explanations are never enough in the ancient world, because practical acts often carried sacred meaning. A wall that diverts floodwater can also become a barrier against chaos. A tower that watches the horizon can also become a place of ceremony. A construction project that protects houses can also bind the living community to its ancestors. In early Jericho, where the dead lay beneath floors and human skulls could be reshaped with plaster, it would be strange to imagine architecture as purely functional. The same hands that cut grain and carried stone also tended memory, ritual, and belief. The wall may have been a line between worlds. Inside were the houses, the dead, the spring, the stored food, the known voices, the familiar paths, the order of the community. Outside lay animals, strangers, dry lands, storms, darkness, and powers not yet domesticated by memory. The wall did not simply keep danger away. It may have helped define what the people were. To live inside the wall was to belong to a shared story. To pass through its entrance was to cross from uncertainty into human order. The tower deepens this possibility. Its internal stairway suggests not only height, but experience. Climbing within stone could have carried meaning beyond observation. It might have been used during rites tied to the seasons, to the movement of the sun, to communal gatherings, to the memory of construction, or to the presence of ancestors. Even if it began as a lookout or structural feature, the act of ascent may have become charged with significance over time. Human beings do not repeatedly climb monumental places without creating stories about them. Some scholars have considered whether the tower related to celestial observation. In a world without calendars carved on tablets, people still needed to track seasons. Plant gathering, harvesting, hunting, and ceremonies all depended on time. The horizon was a clock, and the sky was a text written in light. A tower could have allowed certain alignments or observations of sunrise, sunset, stars, or mountain shadows. We cannot claim this with certainty, but the possibility reminds us that early communities were not trapped in the immediate present. They watched cycles. They remembered recurrence. They learned to anticipate. If the tower helped mark time, then it was not merely a structure of stone, but an instrument of order. The annual return of light to a particular point on the horizon could tell people when to gather, when to harvest, when to begin certain tasks, when to honor the dead, when to renew bonds. Timekeeping is power. Those who know the seasons can guide society. Those who speak for the sky may speak with authority. No ordinary household can easily challenge. And yet, another possibility remains. The tower and wall may have been built to create social cohesion. This idea is subtle, but powerful. In a growing settlement, people from different households, lineages, and backgrounds needed reasons to cooperate. Shared labor can create unity. A demanding construction project may have functioned as a social engine, forcing coordination, producing obligation, and giving people a common achievement. The monument becomes proof that the community exists. Think of the wall not only as the result of society, but as one of its makers. Before the work, households may have been loosely allied around water and food. During the work, they had to organize, negotiate, and labor together. After the work, they could point to the structure and say, "This is ours." The wall became a memory of cooperation made permanent. The tower became a sign of collective effort, visible above the roofs. Architecture created identity. This does not require modern-style leadership. Ritual may have supplied the motivation. If the building project was framed as necessary for the ancestors, the spring, the safety of children, the turning of the seasons, or the protection of the dead, people may have accepted burdens that mere practicality could not demand. Humans will work for survival, but they will suffer for meaning. The earliest monuments may have been born when necessity and belief became impossible to separate. There is also the possibility of display. Jericho may have wished to impress outsiders. A large wall and tower could communicate strength, permanence, and control of water. They could deter attack without being used in combat. They could say, "This is not an open camp, not a fragile cluster of huts, not an easy prize. This place is established, its people are many, its labor is organized, its identity is stone." Display, too, works inward. A monument reminds the inhabitants of their own power. Every morning the tower stands. Every return from the fields or open country brings the wall back into view. Children grow beneath its shadow and inherit not only the structure, but the feeling that their community is ancient, protected, and exceptional. The monument teaches belonging without words. The most honest conclusion is that the wall and tower likely lived many lives of meaning. They may have answered several needs at once: defense, flood protection, ritual performance, timekeeping, social identity, ancestral memory, and status display may not have been separate categories to the builders. The modern mind divides them in order to analyze. The ancient world may have held them together. A stone placed against water could also be a stone placed against chaos. A tower used for watching could also be a tower used for wonder. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The stones do not tell us what songs were sung when they were raised. They do not preserve the names of those who first proposed the work. They do not reveal whether fear or faith burned hotter in the hearts of the builders. They leave us with a structure and a silence, with evidence and absence joined together. Jericho's wall and tower endure because they refuse to become ordinary. They stand at the beginning of a long human habit, the habit of building more than shelter, of turning anxiety into architecture, of making belief heavy enough to cast a shadow. Whether born from flood, fear, or faith, these stones show us a people who had begun to answer the world with permanence. There is a silence in the mound that is not empty. It is the silence of rooms no longer entered, floors no longer swept, hearths gone cold, and walls allowed to soften back into earth. At Jericho, the earliest great experiment in settlement did not continue in an unbroken line of triumph. Like all human creations, it met pressure. The community that had gathered beside the spring raised stone, buried its dead, and shaped a new relationship with place, eventually changed, diminished, or was abandoned in ways that remain difficult to fully explain. Abandonment is one of the most haunting words in archaeology. It sounds simple, almost clean. People left, yet no abandonment is merely an absence. It is made of decisions, fears, deaths, arguments, failed expectations, and new possibilities elsewhere. A house is abandoned when a family no longer believes it can remain. A settlement is abandoned when enough households make that decision that the place loses its life. But the reasons may be many, and they may not arrive all at once. The early levels of Jericho show phases of occupation, rebuilding, and transformation. The people did not simply appear in a single moment and vanish in another. Their world rose and fell in pulses. Some structures were repaired, others were covered. Some customs endured, others shifted. The mound records change not as drama narrated by kings, but as altered soil, sealed floors, collapsed mud brick, abandoned spaces, and new building traditions cutting into old ones. Why did the first major settlement fade? Climate remains one possible pressure. The early Holocene world was not static. Rainfall patterns shifted. Vegetation zones moved. Water sources changed in volume and reliability. Even a spring-fed settlement could be affected by broader environmental stress. Surrounding plant resources might decline. Game animals might change their routes. Erosion or sedimentation might alter the immediate landscape. A community dependent on local resources could find itself slowly squeezed, not by one catastrophe, but by a tightening ring of difficulty. Population may have played its part. Success can become a burden. A settlement that survives attracts more people. Families grow, children stay, houses multiply. Storage needs increase. Refuse accumulates. Nearby resources are used more intensively. Wood must be gathered from farther away. Wild foods become harder to find. Hunting pressure may reduce animal availability close to the settlement. What began as an oasis of security can become a crowded place of strain. Disease is another shadow. Permanent settlement brought human beings into closer, more continuous contact with each other, with waste, with stored food, with insects, and eventually with managed animals. Even before the full rise of animal domestication, the conditions of sedentary life could encourage new patterns of illness. A mobile group can leave a contaminated camp. A settled community must live with its own accumulation. The very permanence that made Jericho extraordinary may also have made it vulnerable. Social tension may have deepened the crisis. A wall can unite, but it can also divide. Stored food can protect, but it can also produce jealousy. Ancestors beneath floors can strengthen belonging, but also sharpen disputes over house, lineage, and place. If certain households gained more influence through storage, ritual objects, labor control, or ancestral claims, resentment may have grown. Early settlement required cooperation, but cooperation is not peace. It is effort. It must be renewed constantly. There may have been conflict with outsiders, though direct evidence is difficult to read. A valuable spring in a harsh basin would have remained attractive. If conditions worsened in surrounding regions, more groups may have come toward reliable water. Raiding, competition, or negotiated access could have placed pressure on the settlement. A wall may discourage danger, but no wall abolishes it. The fear that once unified people can, over time, exhaust them. Yet abandonment need not mean disaster in the dramatic sense. People may have left because opportunities changed. New settlements may have appeared elsewhere. Networks may have shifted. Families may have moved to places with better land, easier access to resources, or stronger kin connections. Human history is not only collapse, it is also movement, adjustment, and reinvention. The fading of one community can be the beginning of another. This matters because we are often tempted to imagine the end of early Jericho as failure. But failure may be the wrong word. The first inhabitants tested a form of life that no human population had fully mastered. They tried permanence. They built heavily. They organized labor. They deepened the bond between house, food, water, and ancestors. Even if the settlement contracted or was abandoned, the knowledge did not vanish from the human world. People carried memories, techniques, habits, and perhaps stories with them. The mound itself remained. That is crucial. An abandoned place is not the same as a forgotten place. The spring continued to flow. The rise in the earth remained visible. The traces of walls and buried houses lay beneath dust. Later, people could return to a place already charged with antiquity, even if they did not know the full depth beneath their feet. Places gather power through return, and Jericho was the kind of place that invited return. In the archaeology of abandonment, the smallest details can be revealing. Were objects left in place as if departure was sudden? Were houses cleared, suggesting planned movement? Were floors renewed shortly before abandonment, hinting at unexpected disruption? Were burials still respected? Were structures deliberately filled or simply left to decay? Each pattern tells a different story, but time has blurred many answers. Erosion, later building, and ancient disturbances complicate the record. Still, the traces suggest that the early settlement didn't end as a single clean event. It transformed through stages. The emotional life of that transformation is almost impossible to recover, yet it must have been real. Imagine a family deciding to leave a house where ancestors rested beneath the floor. Imagine the last fire allowed to die. Imagine tools packed, children gathered, water skins filled, doorways left open or sealed. Imagine elders who resisted departure because memory held them there. Imagine younger people looking beyond the settlement with more hope than grief. A place can become beloved and unbearable at the same time. The dead below the floors make leaving especially powerful. To depart from such a house was to separate from more than architecture. It was to leave a lineage anchored in earth. Perhaps skulls, bones, or ritual objects were taken. Perhaps some ancestors were left behind as guardians of a place that would be revisited. Perhaps the distinction between leaving and remaining was not absolute. Some families may have moved seasonally or returned for ceremonies. The mound may have retained spiritual importance even during times of reduced occupation. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. New methods may sharpen the picture. Ancient environmental sampling, residue analysis, refined radiocarbon dating, micromorphology, genomic data, and careful re-examination of old excavation records may reveal patterns now invisible. But even the best science may not recover motive completely. Archaeology can show us that people left. It struggles to tell us how it felt, and so the silence after settlement becomes one of Jericho's deepest lessons. Permanence was never guaranteed. The first towns were fragile experiments, balanced between water and drought, cooperation and conflict, memory and movement. The people who built Jericho did not step into civilization as though entering a finished house. They walked onto unstable ground and tried to make it hold. The mound remembers both their achievement and their vulnerability. Its abandoned layers are not empty pauses between important events. They are evidence of human limits. They remind us that every city, no matter how ancient or powerful, depends on conditions that can change: water, food, trust, health, belief, and memory must all endure together. When they do not, even stone can fall silent. When people returned to the mound, they did not simply rebuild what had been there before. They brought new habits, new architecture, new ways of arranging domestic life, and perhaps new ideas about what a settled community ought to be. The earth that held the earlier houses became the foundation for a changed world. Jericho was not reborn as a perfect copy of itself. It was reimagined. One of the most visible changes was architectural, rounded houses, so characteristic of earlier settlement traditions, gradually gave way in many Neolithic communities to rectangular forms. This shift may sound technical, but it carried enormous consequences. A round house stands apart more naturally. Its curved walls create a self-contained unit. A rectangular house can be joined to another. Rooms can be added. Walls can share lines. Space can be subdivided with greater efficiency. Storage, work, sleep, and ritual activity can be separated more clearly. Architecture began to discipline daily life in new ways. At later Neolithic Jericho, rectangular mud brick structures suggest a community thinking differently about space. Houses could now become more complex. Interiors could include multiple rooms or activity zones. Floors could be carefully plastered, renewed, and kept clean. Walls could support more organized domestic arrangements. The household was no longer only a sheltering circle. It was becoming a system of rooms, passages, storage places, and controlled surfaces. This transformation mattered because buildings shape behavior. A circular room encourages one kind of gathering. A rectangular building with separate compartments encourages another. It can create privacy, hierarchy, storage control, and specialized activity. It can allow households to expand without abandoning their old footprint. It can turn domestic life into something more structured, more durable, and perhaps more unequal. When architecture changes, society often changes with it. The materials of these later houses also reveal technical refinement. Mud brick production required consistency. Earth had to be selected, mixed, shaped, dried, and set into courses. Plaster production required knowledge of heat, lime, water, and timing. Floors could be smoothed to an almost luminous finish. In some Neolithic settlements, plastered surfaces were not merely functional but aesthetically powerful, creating clean, pale interiors that caught light and transformed the experience of the house. To live on a plaster floor was to live upon human-made earth. Such floors were renewed over time, sealing earlier surfaces beneath them. This repeated renewal created depth inside the home itself. Each new layer preserved traces of older life below. Dust, ash, tiny plant fragments, microscopic residues, and impressions of activity became trapped in the sequence. To the archaeologist, this is evidence. To the inhabitants, it may have been maintenance, purification, or renewal. A floor remade is a house reborn. The return to Jericho also occurred within a broader Neolithic world of expanding connections. The people of the region were no longer isolated experimenters beside scattered springs. Settlements across the Levant and beyond were changing in dialogue with one another, though not through written messages or formal states. Techniques traveled, stone materials moved, ideas about houses, burial, plaster, plants, and animals spread from community to community. The Neolithic was not a single invention in one place. It was a web. Jericho's location made it part of this web. The Jordan Valley linked different ecological zones, from desert margins to riverine environments to highland slopes. People moving through these zones carried objects, stories, marriage ties, rituals, seeds, and skills. A blade of stone might reveal distant material sources. A style of architecture might echo broader regional practice. A burial custom might show shared beliefs across communities separated by many days of travel. Even before roads and cities, humans were never truly alone. The later Neolithic inhabitants may have lived with a more developed relationship to cultivation. Plants that had once been gathered and tended became increasingly bound to human cycles of sowing, harvesting, storage, and selection. Domesticated traits in cereals emerged gradually, shaped by human harvesting habits and repeated planting. The plant world was being remade through daily labor. People were not merely taking food from nature. They were altering the evolutionary futures of the species they depended upon. Animal relationships also shifted across the wider Neolithic. In different regions and phases, goats, sheep, cattle, and pigs became increasingly managed. This did not happen everywhere at once, nor in the same way, but it formed part of the great transformation of human economies. Herding changed movement, landscape use, diet, social wealth, and ideas of ownership. A living animal could become stored value, future food, ritual offering, bride wealth, or a sign of household strength. The world of settlement was becoming more entangled with controlled life. At Jericho, the dead remained important, but mortuary customs may have shifted in emphasis and form over time. The treatment of skulls and bodies continued to speak of ancestry, identity, and household memory. Yet changing architecture may have changed the relationship between the living and the dead. In a more compartmentalized house, certain rooms or surfaces may have carried specific meanings. The dead could remain beneath floors, but domestic space was becoming more complex. Ritual geography may have deepened. The return to the mound also raises a powerful question. Did later inhabitants know they were building over an older settlement? They may not have understood its true age, but they likely encountered traces, old walls, unusual stones, human remains, compacted surfaces, and fragments of earlier life could emerge during digging. A mound is never neutral ground. It contains surprises. Later people may have treated these discoveries with fear, reverence, indifference, or practical reuse. The past beneath them may have become part of their own sense of place. There is a strange intimacy in building on a tell. Every foundation cuts into former lives. Every wall rests upon the ruin of another wall. Every floor seals someone else's activity. The inhabitants of later Jericho lived not only beside ancestors they personally remembered, but above communities already ancient to them. Their own lives became part of a vertical chain, layer by layer, household by household, generation by generation. The rectangular house, therefore, becomes more than an architectural form. It is a sign of transition from early settlement experiment to a more established Neolithic way of life. It suggests changes in planning, labor, household organization, and perhaps social identity. The world was becoming more ordered, but not necessarily simpler. With order came new pressures. With rooms came boundaries. With storage came control. With ancestry came claims. With settlement came history in the ground. The people who rebuilt Jericho were heirs to an enormous human experiment. They inherited a place already heavy with memory, even if much of that memory had no surviving name. They lived under the same hard light, near the same spring, within the same basin where earlier builders had raised impossible stones. But they did not merely preserve, they adapted. They changed the shape of domestic life. They joined a wider Neolithic current moving through the ancient Near East. And still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know what stories they told about the mound. We do not know whether they feared the older dead beneath them. We do not know whether new families arrived from elsewhere, whether old lineages returned, or whether the community blended memory with migration. The soil preserves architecture, but rarely belonging in its full emotional truth. What remains is the evidence of renewal. Jericho did not end with silence. It changed form. Rounded houses gave way to rectangular rooms. Earlier customs met new practices. The mound thickened. Human life returned to the spring, carrying the Neolithic world further into permanence. To rebuild Jericho was to make a statement without writing. This place still mattered. Long after the first builders of Jericho had vanished into the earth, long after their houses had collapsed and their plastered floors had been sealed beneath the weight of later lives, the mound continued to gather meaning. New peoples came, new walls rose, new destructions marked the soil, new stories settled over older ones like wind-blown dust. The place that began as a spring-fed Neolithic settlement became, through the long turning of history, a city of memory, conquest, and legend. This is one of Jericho's strangest powers. It is not only old, it is layered with different kinds of time. There is archaeological time, measured by stratigraphic excavation, radiocarbon dating, pottery sequences, architectural phases, and sediment. There is historical time, where written cultures begin to cast their shadow across the land. And there is sacred time, where events are remembered, reshaped, repeated, and carried by communities for whom the place becomes more than a ruin. Jericho belongs to all of these at once. By the Bronze Age, Jericho stood in a world utterly different from that of the first Neolithic settlers. Across the Near East, cities had grown larger and more complex. Writing had appeared in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Kings ruled. Trade moved metals, timber, stone, textiles, grain, oil, and luxury goods across long distances. Fortifications became grander. Warfare became more organized. Social inequality became more visible. Temples, palaces, administrative systems, and long-distance diplomacy shaped the world of later urban life. Jericho, too, took part in this broader transformation, though always in a way conditioned by its location and its spring. The Bronze Age city had walls of its own, and these later walls would become the focus of intense debate. For many people, Jericho is known not because of its Neolithic tower, but because of stories of conquest, trumpets, and falling walls. Those stories belong to a much later cultural memory, separated by thousands of years from the first settlement. Yet they attached themselves to the same mound, the same oasis, the same ancient place, whose depth no storyteller of later ages could have fully known. This creates a powerful tension. The Jericho of legend and the Jericho of archaeology are not enemies, but they are not the same thing. Legend remembers meaning. Archaeology recovers material sequence. One speaks through narrative, identity, and belief. The other speaks through walls, ceramics, destruction layers, radiocarbon samples, architecture, and the slow discipline of comparison. When they meet, sparks fly. Some seek confirmation, others seek contradiction. But the deeper task is to understand how places become vessels for both evidence and imagination. The later city's destructions are part of this complexity. Archaeologists have debated the dating and interpretation of Jericho's Bronze Age walls for generations. Different excavation methods, chronological systems, ceramic readings, and historical questions have shaped different conclusions. The mound has been asked to answer questions from texts composed long after many of its layers were formed. This has made Jericho one of the most contested places in the archaeology of the southern Levant. Few sites show so clearly how the ground can become a battlefield of memory. But beneath those debates lies something larger. Jericho's sacred and legendary reputation may have grown precisely because it was so visibly ancient. Even before modern excavation revealed its Neolithic depths, the mound stood as a ruin in a landscape of powerful associations. Travelers saw remnants, communities told stories. The oasis itself seemed timeless. Water, palms, heat, ruins, roads, and memory created a place where the past felt close to the surface. Jericho was never just a settlement. It was a landmark of human imagination. To later peoples, ancient ruins often carried an aura of the uncanny. A wall whose builders are forgotten can become the work of giants. A collapsed city can become proof of divine judgment. A spring can become holy. A mound can become a witness. When people encounter old stones without knowing the names of those who raised them, they create meanings to fill the silence. In this way, the Neolithic dead, the Bronze Age inhabitants, the later storytellers, pilgrims, conquerors, and archaeologists all became part of Jericho's long afterlife. The first town was buried beneath the biblical city, and the biblical city was buried beneath centuries of interpretation. Yet the Neolithic foundations changed the whole picture once they were recognized. Suddenly, Jericho was not merely ancient in the terms of written history, it was prehistoric in a way that shook the imagination. Its deepest story belonged not to armies or kings, but to people before writing, before metal, before pottery, before the familiar signs of civilization. The mound was older than the stories told about it, older than the languages that later named it, older than the empires that claimed the land around it. This does not make the later stories unimportant. It makes the place more extraordinary. Jericho shows how human beings continually reuse the same landscapes to ask different questions. The Neolithic settlers asked how to live beside water in a changing world. The Bronze Age inhabitants asked how to defend, trade, worship, and rule within a city system. Later traditions asked what the fall of walls meant in the story of divine power, obedience, judgment, and identity. Modern archaeology asks how these layers relate, where they differ, and what can be known from the surviving evidence. Each age found its own Jericho. There is a danger in letting one layer swallow all the others. If we see only the legendary city, we miss the prehistoric revolution beneath it. If we see only the Neolithic settlement, we miss the extraordinary afterlife of the place in human memory. If we see only the scientific sequence, we risk forgetting that people do not live by evidence alone. They live by story, belonging, grief, fear, and hope. Jericho matters because it holds all of these in one mound. The transition from first town to legendary city also reminds us that civilization is not a single invention, but a long accumulation. The people of 9,000 before Christ did not build the cities of the Bronze Age, yet they opened pathways that later societies expanded. Settlement, architecture, ancestry, storage, boundary making, labor organization, and sacred place all belong to the early experiment. Later, urban life would transform these elements into more elaborate systems, but the seeds were already present, not inevitable, not fully formed, but present. By the time later fortified cities rose across the ancient Near East, human beings had become accustomed to things that were once radical. Permanent houses, ancestral claims to land, food storage, communal works, boundaries, ritual centers, social memory tied to place. Jericho's earliest phases reveal these things in their fragile beginnings. Its later phases show how those beginnings could be buried beneath more complex worlds, and then rediscovered as something almost unbelievable. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The oldest inhabitants left no account of themselves. The Bronze Age dead do not explain every destruction. The later stories do not resolve every archaeological problem. The mound keeps its counsel. It offers evidence, but not confession. It invites interpretation, but resists possession. Every generation approaches Jericho with its own questions, and every generation finds the mound both generous and silent. What can be said is that Jericho became more than the sum of its occupations. It became a symbol of origins, endurance, destruction, and return. It became a place where the human need for permanence met the equally human reality of collapse. Walls rose and fell. Houses filled with dust. Springs continued to flow. Stories survived in forms their first subjects could never have imagined. The first builders could not know that later ages would cover their world with legends of armies and divine command. They could not know that scholars would one day sift their floors, date their charcoal, examine their tools, and argue over the meaning of their stones. They knew only their own lives, the spring, the heat, the labor, the dead beneath them, the demands of each season, and yet their presence remained. Beneath every later Jericho lies the older mystery. Beneath the city of story lies the city before story. Beneath the walls of memory lies the wall that should not exist. The mound stands because human beings kept returning to the same place, drawn by water, history, and something harder to name. Jericho is not one city. It is the long echo of many human worlds, built one above another, each seeking permanence, each becoming earth. At the end of Jericho's long road, we are left with a mound, a spring, and a question that refuses to die. What does it mean for human beings to begin building permanence? Not shelter for a night, not a camp for a season, not a temporary refuge from storm, hunger, or danger. Permanence? The decision to remain? The decision to return? The decision to place the dead beneath the living and trust that children will wake in the same place where their grandparents once watched the dawn. Jericho is often called one of the first cities, but perhaps that phrase is too narrow. A city, in the later sense, brings to mind streets, markets, temples, rulers, walls, laws, trade, and written records. Jericho at 9,000 before Christ had none of those things in their familiar forms. Yet something essential was already there: a gathering around water, a shared investment in architecture, a boundary of stone, a tower raised above ordinary life, houses renewed across generations, food stored against tomorrow, ancestors kept close, a community beginning to think of itself as rooted. That is why Jericho matters. It stands at the threshold between movement and settlement, between landscape used and landscape claimed, between memory carried in the body and memory buried in the ground. It shows us that civilization did not begin in sudden brilliance. It gathered slowly, unevenly, through experiment, fear, hope, hunger, cooperation, grief, and astonishing imagination. The first builders did not know they were ancient. They did not know they would become evidence. They did not know their walls would trouble the theories of scholars 10,000 years later. They lived inside the urgency of their own days. A child cried. A roof needed repair. A blade broke. A body had to be buried. Grain had to be ground. Water had to be carried. Strangers appeared on the horizon. The sun dropped behind the western heights. Night came, and with it the old human need to gather near fire and meaning. We look back and call them prehistoric, as though they existed before history. But that word is misleading. They existed before writing, not before history. Their history was real. It was spoken, remembered, sung, enacted, built, and buried. It lived in the placement of houses, in the care of skulls, in the labor of stone, in the path worn between dwelling and spring. Their world did not need writing to be profound. It only needed human beings. The more we learn through radiocarbon dating, stratigraphic excavation, lithic analysis, environmental reconstruction, and genomic data, the more the old picture of human progress becomes unsettled. The neat ladder breaks. The first towns do not appear as simple results of agriculture. The first monuments do not wait politely for kings. Ritual, ancestry, climate stress, cooperation, food production, and social identity all move together. Jericho teaches us that the roots of civilization are tangled, not straight. Perhaps people built because they feared hunger. Perhaps they built because they feared outsiders. Perhaps they built because water forced them into closeness. Perhaps they built because the dead required remembrance. Perhaps they built because the human mind, once gathered in numbers, begins to ask stone to do what memory alone cannot. A wall can protect, a tower can watch, a house can shelter, but all of them can also speak. They can say, "We are here, we were here, we intend to remain," is maybe the oldest voice of the city. Not command, not conquest, not wealth, but presence. Jericho's legacy is not that it solved the problem of civilization. It did not. No city ever has. Cities magnify human possibility, but also human danger. They create abundance and inequality, memory and conflict, beauty and waste, protection and disease. The earliest settlement was fragile because all settlements are fragile. Every city depends on water, food, trust, labor, and belief. Remove enough of these, and even the greatest walls become ruins. And yet we keep building. We build in floodplains, deserts, mountains, forests, coasts, and valleys. We gather around rivers, springs, ports, roads, wells, and now invisible networks of light and code. We raise towers higher than anything the builders of Jericho could have imagined, yet the old questions remain unchanged. How do we live together? Who belongs inside the boundary? Who controls water and food? How do we honor the dead? What do we owe the generations not yet born? What makes a place worth defending, repairing, and remembering? Jericho does not answer these questions for us. It hands them back. The mound is humble compared with the ruins of later empires. It has no colossal statues like Egypt, no royal libraries like Assyria, no marble temples like Greece, no imperial roads like Rome. But its humility is part of its greatness. Jericho belongs to the deep foundation of everything that followed. It is not the shout of civilization at its height. It is the first low murmur of settlement becoming destiny. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The first language of Jericho is gone. The names of its builders are gone. Their songs are gone. Their arguments are gone. Their gods, if gods they named, remain beyond our reach. We do not know what they thought when the tower first stood complete, or what a child felt looking up at it from the dust. We do not know whether they were proud, afraid, grateful, or burdened by what they had made. But the stones remain, the spring remains, the mound remains. And perhaps that is enough to humble us. Because the people of ancient Jericho were not failed versions of ourselves, they were not crude beginnings waiting for true civilization to arrive. They were human beings at the edge of a great transformation, making choices without knowing where those choices would lead. They stood, as we stand, between inheritance and uncertainty. They received a world from those before them and altered it for those after them. That is all any generation ever does. When we lose ourselves among the myriad altars of the past, among the walls, towers, skulls, hearths, and hidden floors of ancient places, we are not escaping the present. We are learning how deep the present goes. Every modern city carries Jericho somewhere inside it. Every street, every home, every cemetery, every boundary, every argument over land and water, every tower raised into the sky, carries the memory of that first decision to remain. At Jericho, gods and mortals once walked the earth, or perhaps it only seems that way because the earliest settled world lies so far beneath us that it feels divine. The people there were mortal. As we are mortal, their walls fell, their houses vanished, their bodies returned to earth. Yet something of them endured, not as a name, but as a turning point. Beside a spring in the desert, humanity began to gather itself into permanence, and from that gathering came the long, difficult, magnificent road to us. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. End of script. Good night.